All right, what's going on, everyone? Got a handful of pretty interesting national security topics that have come up over the course of the last week, so we're going to dive into a few of them here. The first is something that came out first in the New York Times and was subsequently reported across a handful of different channels, saying that declassified intelligence shows that the FSB, the Russian FSB, is creating a grooming campaign to build a network of future Western influencers who the FSB hoped would develop into Kremlin supporters. So when I hear that, my first thought is like social media influencer. I don't think that's exactly where they're going, but it does look like it's got to be a part, and more on that in a second. It says Russian intelligence is operating a systematic program to launder pro-Kremlin propaganda through private relationships between Russian operatives and unwitting U.S. and Western targets, according to the newly declassified intelligence. Now, I do think we have to be careful with this. Something that comes to mind is the Red Scare of the Cold War era, where we saw communists everywhere, even in places where they weren't. So, this report right now is pretty vague. It is calling out some individuals. We'll bring those folks up here in a second, but they're Russian citizens, so it's nothing like too explosive, and most of them are still in Russia. They're not putting out names of actual Westerners that might have been used in this capacity, which I think is it's a fine line to walk. I think on the one hand, you have to provide that information. You have to provide the data to support that if you're going to call somebody out for that kind of thing. It's a really, really serious issue. But they're, kind of keeping it nice and vague here. We'll see how it develops. But they say that, quote, these influence operations are designed to be deliberately small scale. The overall goal being U.S. and Western persons presenting these ideas seemingly organically, a U.S. official said. And that's where I mentioned, they talk a little bit about kind of some larger figures, very, very public figures. But when they're talking about seeding it at sort of a smaller level, that makes me think that there's probably an effort. There has to be an effort, right? Reaching out to people on social media with smaller channels, or maybe just not as well-known channels, whether it's on YouTube, TikTok, an Instagram page, Facebook, whatever it is. Gotta think they're looking there as well. So they did go on to say, the U.S. official, that ultimately a lot of these targets are unwitting people. They remain unaware as to who is essentially seeding these narratives. They did put out a couple names, which I'm sure I'm going to butcher here, but Natalia Berlinova, Andrei Stepanenko, Maxim Grigorev, and then Anton Svetkov. We'll give that a shot. I don't know how familiar anybody's going to be with any of those names, but it sounds like those are some of the folks that were helping to at least establish what some of these, grooming type organizations could look like. All right, moving on to battlefield updates in Ukraine. Now, if you'll notice, I haven't put out a lot of these videos for about a month or so now. And the reason for that is I found myself getting way, way down into the weeds, dissecting multiple Russian and Ukrainian Telegram accounts to try to determine exactly how far Ukraine had advanced on day X. But realistically, that information was already delayed. So we're looking at reports that are delayed from something else. And it felt like I was playing this game almost of trying to feel like I knew exactly what was going on when every piece of information was dated to some degree, right? And I was thinking if somebody's trying to learn about what's happening with the war or get an understanding of where things sit right now, if I were to spend 3 videos in a week or something talking about the back and forth as to whether or not one small town in southern Ukraine was actually in Ukrainian control or was still in Russian control, I don't know that helps people understand the big picture of the war. I think it loses them, to be honest. I know there are a lot of folks, and probably some of you watching this video, that are looking for that level of detail. It is still something I follow on Telegram and Twitter, but I don't know that getting into those deep, deep weeds over and over again necessarily helps the majority of people understand, the direction the war is going and how the war is playing out. That said, it's been a couple weeks since we've talked about what's going on in the battlefield, so I thought it was worth getting into it here. The Ukrainian offensive that kicked off a few months ago is still ongoing. There's still 3 main focal areas of the Ukrainian offensive. In the east is Bakhmut, moving further south, Velika Novosilka, and then furthest west, Orahib, which is where most of the progress on the Ukrainian side has been over the last week or so. And it has picked up in terms of progress. Ukraine and Russian accounts have confirmed that Ukraine has taken the town of Robotyne, which is generally on the way to Tokmak, which is largely considered to be one of the possible goals of the Ukrainian offensive, moving to Tokmak and then potentially on down towards Melitopol and the Sea of Azov. That was, if you could war game this thing out before it started, that was what a lot of people were looking at, was cutting the Russian forces in that direction. Now, if Ukraine continues on through Robotyne, which there's no real reason for them to stop at this point, there's nothing on the radar as to why they wouldn't continue, they're likely to, in the next few days or weeks, run into the first major Russian line of defense. And this is something that I think has been probably deliberately confusing over the last few months. I don't know if you've ever heard the arguments of, you've probably heard, Ukraine hasn't even breached the Russian line, and then other accounts that Ukraine is through the first line of defense. And like, how do you parse this stuff out? And I think if we step back, what's going on there is Russia set up multiple lines of defense, 2 to 4, depending on where you are across southern and eastern Ukraine. Those lines of defense are pretty robust. They're heavily fortified trench systems, command posts, static anti-tank firing points, anti-tank guided missiles. You've got minefields, dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, all of that stuff. They're pretty substantial. And those are not built at the very leading edge of the front because it's hard to build that kind of thing when you're in direct fire range of your enemy. So they're built, most of those have been built, 5, 10, even in some places 15 kilometers behind what you might consider the front line when looking at a map. But that also doesn't mean that the entire area forward of that is just empty or just Russians standing out in the open hoping Ukraine doesn't come through. So forward of that first major line of defense, you still had a lot of trenches. You still had a lot of anti-tank teams. There was artillery coverage over most of that area and minefields after minefields after minefields. So that first area, if you will, there still were Russians in that zone, is a better way to put it. And Ukraine in some areas has pushed through that zone, or at least partially through that zone. So it kind of makes sense both ways. Yes, Ukraine has pushed through some Russian positions that were at the very front, that were very deadly and very well constructed defensive positions, but at the same time, it doesn't look like they've gone up against some of these, larger defensive networks, if you will. That looks like it's coming in the very near term. All right, moving on to this drone swarm program, which is pretty crazy. Just a few days ago, Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks said that the U.S. is kicking off an initiative called Replicator. And Replicator is supposed to end up with, thousands of cheap drones set to be used across air, land, and sea in the next couple of years. So the reason for this, what Hicks cites, is that it's designed to counter China, that in a potential war with China, their greatest asset is mass. More ships, more missiles, more people. So the idea to help counter that is going to be thousands upon thousands of these drones. So one of the issues brought up in a potential war with China is the idea that there are so many targets across a large geographic space. So this is one of the possibilities to counter that. And the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said that in talking about metrics of what this would need to be, he said a metric for me is 1,000 targets in 24 hours, which is it's a crazy number. Now, one thing that I thought was interesting in this whole announcement about Replicator, which sounds pretty devious in terms of a Pentagon program, is that there really wasn't any mention of Russia. The focus here is on China. The only time in the announcement and the interviews I've seen about this since that Russia is mentioned is people saying like, well, we're learning from what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. So it's like a small thing, but noticeable. Like just a few years ago, we would have been talking about China and Russia in the same sentence, saying this is going to be something we could use to deter Russia, to deter China. For some reason, I don't know if it's that we view Russia as being too tied up in Ukraine to have to worry about, or if it's, viewing the Russian military and saying maybe they're not the threat we once thought they were. But either way, this pretty significant program in the DoD is being put together not with an eye on Russia, like, at all. Now, they went on to say that this isn't just like developing swarming technology, which is a ton of drones being fired, essentially too many drones for air defense systems to navigate and shoot down. This program is less focused on kind of the idea of swarming and more on the development of those technologies, which is going to be a problem, quite frankly, because we're coming up with this to counter China. Where do you think we're going to get all the cheap parts from? Well, not China anymore. So they talk about some of the reason that these cheap drones have been so successful in places like Ukraine or with Ukrainian and Russian forces is they cite that a lot of the FPV drones, those first-person view drones where the Ukrainians are attaching RPG-7 warheads and crashing them into the side of Russian vehicles, they're saying that a lot of those are costing $400 to $600 on average. Like the Pentagon, roll of toilet paper costs the Pentagon $600, right? Like the idea that we'd be able to get something that cheap is tough. But one of the reasons Ukraine and Russia are able to do that is because they can easily purchase some of these Chinese components. It's not going to be an option for us. So that's definitely 100% going to be an issue in whether or not this replicator program can actually be rolled out to the force. Earlier this week, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and all those, said that they shut down the largest Chinese influence operation that they have ever discovered on their platform. So they say the operation was spreading pro-Chinese messages and attacked critics of Beijing's policies using a sprawling network of fake accounts across more than 50 websites, from Facebook and Instagram to YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, and dozens of smaller platforms and forums. I'm sure the forums were the key to success there. So they say that the fake accounts posted links to articles praising China and denigrating U.S. and European foreign policy, as well as seemingly personal comments that appear to be copy and pasted from a numbered list, resulting in hundreds of identical posts. I think this is hysterical. And it's going to be, there's more to this story. It's not just China. They got some stuff with Russia as well. It's that aspect. There's so much that goes into creating these fake networks and kind of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And you got these dumb bots that are posting the same comments on the same articles in 50 different places. And it's so easily caught on some of these platforms. I think it's hilarious. But anyways, moving on. They say Meta said it had failed to gain, this Chinese network, failed to gain a large following of real people on its platforms or elsewhere online, and few authentic accounts interacted with this content. And this is what I think is pretty interesting. So they say that Meta had removed more than 8,600 Facebook accounts, pages, groups, and Instagram accounts with a collective following of over 500,000 accounts, which sounds big. And I've talked about some of the failed U.S. propaganda stuff that our government has gotten caught with on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And it's always really small following. So 500,000 sounds like a lot. They go on. However, the company said that many of those followers were themselves fake accounts because the Chinese operation appeared to have bought pages from spam operators in Vietnam and Bangladesh that create pages and populate them with bot followers. So we've got this big Chinese influence operation that's creating fake content under fake accounts, and then all of the followers, all the people seeing it, are bots and fake accounts that China buys to give those accounts, I guess, more legitimacy. And it's kind of funny, right? In my mind, it's bots spreading information, more bots, and it just kind of spins and it goes. Nobody in the real world actually sees it. They go on to say that some of the pages abruptly switched from posting ads to sharing political content. So they had things where one site had been constantly posting lingerie ads in Chinese and out of nowhere switched to English and started posting organic content about riots in Kazakhstan. I don't know. I can't imagine what on earth would trigger a review of that account. Now, they did say that some of these accounts eventually got lucky and broke out into the public, but they were so weird and so off that people in the comments were very quickly saying I don't know, this looks like a fake account. So seems super successful. But in this same report, Meta says that they've been dealing with this doppelganger operation that Russia's been putting together. So this doppelganger thing is that Russia has been creating fake websites for things like The Guardian, major German newspapers, The Washington Post and Fox News, Israeli news sites, even NATO. And they make these fake websites and then they publish articles on those and try to get people to disseminate them so it looks like a headline from one of these legitimate institutions. And they're all, according to this article, all of them are designed to undermine international support for Ukraine. So it's kind of like a single purpose to this entire campaign. inside of Russia. And Meta said that this operation, this doppelganger operation, is the largest and most aggressively persistent it has seen from Russia since 2017. The company says, Meta says that it has taken down thousands of fake accounts and pages connected to the network and blocked more than 2,000 domains from being shared on Facebook and Instagram in the past year. They added, again, you knew this was coming, right? They say, like the Chinese operation, however, this Russian operation has not gained much traction among real social media users, in part because the fake accounts it uses to promote links to its spoofed websites are so obviously fake as to be quickly detected. And they interviewed some guy who said there's a strange disconnect between the intricate websites and the smash and grab approach on social media. So again, there's so much work and you got to think money going into trying to come up with some of these misinformation, disinformation campaigns. And then when it comes to the distribution, it's so messy and so very clearly like a bot account or something that just stood up and is distributing all sorts of random information. Is clearly not a real person. It's interesting that the money and the effort doesn't appear to have been spent on distribution. But who knows? Go back to the first story we talked about here. Maybe the goal down the road, distribution for these fake stories and fake websites, are actually going to be those Western influencers that the FSB is trying to slowly groom over time. We'll see. But that's all I got for now. All of these stories and more, as well as some podcast recommendations, were in this morning's Sit Rep. It goes direct to your inbox. If interested, the link is in the description below. But thanks for watching. We'll see y'all next time.